Do you remember the story I told you about the God with no hands? The story of how our world came into being. I am going to tell you another story about what happened all that long, long time ago. It's called The Story of the Coming of Life. It is about the plants and animals and us. Can you do something? Can you go back in your minds to when the earth was just being born? At first, there was only a fiery ball of light and heat, and tiny particles were obeying the laws they were given. Some were attracted to each other and some were not. The particles formed themselves into solids, liquids, and gases. The particles settled down according to their laws and created rocks and water with the air all around them. The clouds formed by the volcanoes disappeared, and now the sun could see the earth, a beautiful pearl in space. When the sun looked at it, it couldn't help looking at it all the time. And that went on and on. But one day, the sun saw something that was not quite right. Something was happening. There was trouble. It rained, and as it rained, the water absorbed certain gases from the air. The rain and gases combined and created a kind of liquid acid. This acid fell on the rocks and began to dissolve the rocks. The dissolved rocks washed into the waters of the seas. The storms kept happening. It kept on raining and the rocks were being broken more and more. The seas became filled with salts created by the dissolved rock. The beautiful order and harmony was being threatened. Who was causing it? Who was the culprit? Sun looked at water and thought, "Perhaps it is she?" But water said, "I am not to blame. Remember how I am made? When I'm hot, I become vapor and I rise and I disappear. When I get cold, I fall as a liquid. Then I fill in the hollows around the rocks. Being a liquid, I must press downwards and sideways. I don't have any choice about where I am to go. It is my silly sister air who stirs me up, then drops me on the rocks. What can I do about that?" Air jumped in and cried, "Why accuse me? My job is to cover the earth with layers of blankets so she won't get cold. The earth has a big tummy, but her head and feet are always frozen, so I always have to be on the move. Whenever I come near water, she jumps on my back and I have to carry her around piggyback. Now I don't mind doing it when the ground is flat. But when I run into the mountains, it's different. The mountains are very inconsiderate and just sit there. They don't even budge. And sometimes, the rocks get so hot that I have to rise fast. I have to climb the mountains and then it is cold at the top. Water becomes too heavy for me to carry. I can't play with her all the time." And the mountains said with one voice, "It's not our fault. We just sit there because as solids, that is what we are supposed to do. The sun looks at us all day and makes us hot. What can we do about that? It must be your fault, sun." The arguing went on. It seemed that everyone was at fault. No one wanted to take the blame. And of course, they were all right. All of them were just obeying their laws, doing what was supposed to be done. But the order and harmony was threatened. Something needed to be done. Something new was needed. And then, something else very wonderful indeed happened. A new thing appeared. A tiny blob of jelly, almost invisible, too small to see. And to this little blob was given a new gift that would help it save the earth. To this blob was given new laws. In order to exist, you must eat and grow and you will have the power to make others just like you. And so life came in this way. These tiny, almost invisible blobs of jelly were the first life forms. They had sensitivity. Like tiny little machines, they went right to work to clean up the oceans. And they were able to make others like themselves by just splitting up, as if you had a car that could split into two cars, and those two cars could split into two cars, and so on and so on. And so these tiny invisible blobs of jelly began the work of cleaning up the seas. As they fed upon the salts in the water, they built their own bodies with those salts. Some found the water itchy, so they made shells to protect their bodies. When they died, the shells fell to the bottom of the sea, with the salts forever trapped in their shells. And time passed on. These creatures lived and died, and layer upon layer of the tiny shells piled up on the bottom of sea. The layers were like the pages of a book we can read if we know how. The book of life on earth. What can we see in that book? The first particles of life were one-celled little blobs. The one cell did all the work of living, all the eating, all the moving, all the getting rid of waste. These we call unicellular organisms, and they drifted around the seas, cleaning the water for a very long time, and they are even here on Earth today. At some point, some of the one-celled particles bonded together into bigger creatures, each cell doing the same thing, but working together more efficiently. They were multicellular, many cells. And then the cells decided to share the work, each one doing a part, some to breathe, some to eat, some to move. They started to look very different in the same animal. The cells grouped together to make special organs like a heart. When the book of life on earth can be opened, all these creatures were there. The tiny one-celled creatures, the multicellular creatures, and the creatures with different organs. At this point, one begins to open the timeline bit by bit. The timeline of life, the Cambrian. Let's have a look and see what we can look at the pages of the book of the earth that we have here on our timeline. All the creatures are living in water, and we find unicellular creatures like this, the amoeba. There are the flagellates who moved about with things like little whips. And there are multicellular creatures such as the sponge with many cells but no specialization. All the cells are doing the same work but together. And there is one creature moving about in great numbers. These are the Trilobites. They had organs. The Trilobites appeared in great variety and size. They were feeding, making copies of themselves, and cleaning up the waters. We don't have Trilobites around anymore, but they were around for a long time at the beginning of the earth. Ordovician and Silurian. Time went on. In this story, all kinds of creatures appeared and all sorts of experiments went on. Look at this strange creature, the cephalopod. Why does it look so peculiar? It has legs attached to its head. These are the crinoids, the sea lilies. The crinoids looked like trees, but they were actually animals. They were the next group after the trilobites to take over the cleansing of the seas. They made pillars of rings of stone to protect their delicate bodies within. They couldn't move, so they waved their arms to move the water to their mouths to get their food. When they died, the stalk of rings collapsed and lay at the bottom of the sea. At this time, the seas were full of life. Towards the end, though, many of the creatures of the sea had died out. Another experiment was the creatures that used the salts from the water and the light from the sun to make their food. The very first aquatic plants, the blue-green algae. These creatures drifted around on the seas with the tides, and when they came to the edge of the sea, they remained on the rocks until the tide came back. As they remained outside the water, some seemed to like it there. The air outside was full of gas they could use for food. Some remained outside the water and fed hungrily on the gas. When they died, they left their bodies there, preparing the ground for other experiments to come. Devonian. So for the first time, life was trying out the land, and gradually, these creatures were the ones that developed into the plants that we know. But the story is not over yet. There's more. Corals were building up the land, making islands by eating the salts of the seas. And something else was going on with how the animals supported their bodies. Up until now, all the support was outside the body, like shells. But some experiments were happening with support inside the body. Those became the first fish. There were armored fish that lived on the bottom of the sea, and they jumped out and caught passing creatures to eat. And then came the fishes with movable fins. These were very mobile and could move quickly. Once this experiment became a success, a great variety appeared. Orogeny, a period of mountain building. These mountains tell us that the land was rising. Many plants moved to the land. Many creatures crawled out of the sea onto land and became the first insects. Some of them grew to enormous sizes, and because the land was rising, where once there was sea, now there was land. And some fish found themselves cut off from the sea. What to do? It was an imperative. Solve the problem or die. Some fish began to solve the problem. They began to develop a sac inside their bodies in order to breathe out of the water. This was another new experiment, the secret of breathing outside of water. Age of Amphibians. And so the amphibians appeared. They lived partly on the land and partly in the water. Fins aren't much used on the land, so these creatures also developed legs. These were the frogs and salamanders. And where before there was only the crashing of waves on the rock, the sound of rain, the rush of the wind, and the humming of a few insects to be heard, now there was the sound of the new creatures, the amphibians. Imagine that? Carboniferous. What else was going on? Plants spread onto the land and put down roots and grew stems. They increased in size and variety. The lepidodendron is a plant with scale-like leaves that look like the wings of a butterfly. There was plenty of sunshine and gases from the air for the plants to make their food. Some of these plants, like the ferns, grew very, very tall. The amphibians were having a great time with lots of food to eat. There was just one little problem. The amphibians had to stay near the water, lay their eggs in the water, and keep their skin moist so they could breathe. Some began to be dissatisfied with this arrangement. They wanted independence. They wanted to travel. Well, what could they do? Some of them solved the problem. They developed a dry skin so they didn't need the water. And they had a shell for their eggs so they could lay them on the land. And these were the reptiles. Permian, Triassic, Jurassic, Age of Reptiles. The reptiles were happy with this life. There were plants to eat, insects to eat, amphibians to eat, and other reptiles to eat. They were extraordinarily successful and lived everywhere, on land, in the air, and in the water. The dinosaurs were particularly successful. Many experiments were tried. Some grew to enormous sizes. These reptiles caused the earth to tremble when they moved. Smaller animals were threatened and felt unsafe around these reptiles. The huge reptiles were like the lords of the earth. But the smaller animals often managed to steal and eat the eggs of the dinosaurs because the dinosaurs didn't always protect their eggs. But they didn't like to be around the dinosaurs. They decided to move away. But to get away, they had to move to a cold place. The big reptiles did not like cold weather. The smaller animals didn't mind. They didn't need as much. They tried a new experiment. They covered their bodies with hair or fur. Those were the mammals. Some covered their bodies with feathers and over time became the birds we know. They could keep their blood warm even without heat from the sun. The birds could fly and they laid their eggs in nests and protected their nests. The mammals carried their eggs inside their bodies and gave them special milk when the young were born. They protected their young, looked after them, and taught them things after birth. Cretaceous. But this is still not the end of the story. A giant meteor may have hit the earth at this time. The world grew cold. The great dinosaurs disappeared from the earth. Cenozoic. Mammals became the masters of the earth. Large mammals thrived. The weather was getting colder and colder, and there was more and more ice. There were many changes on the earth. Some plants and animals died out. Plants that could handle the cold came upon the earth like grasses. Some of the largest mammals couldn't find enough food, so they died out as well. But the smaller animals could survive, even the cold and ice. Then a special creature appeared. This creature had no sharp teeth to eat with, no sharp claws to fight with, no heavy fur to keep warm with. It walked on two legs. But this special creature had something much more important. A large brain to think and imagine with, hands to work with, and just as important, enormous amounts of love. These were the men, women, and children, just like us, who were capable of a special kind of love for their own children and others. These were the human beings. Finally, they could come. But just think, everything I have told you had to happen in order for human beings to be able to appear. They could not have survived until right at this point. If the earth could speak, it might have said, "I have covered myself with thick carpets of grass. The ground is soft under your feet. I have put flowers in my hair and covered myself with jewels. My cupboards are full of milk and honey, and down in my cellar are coal and iron. Now is the time that you can come.